So old Justin Amash wants to impeach Trump, it looks like. After apparently reading through the entire Mueller report, Amash has come to the conclusion that Trump did in fact commit impeachable offenses. And while I disagree with Amash to some extent, I do admire him somewhat for actually reading through the report, because it does give him a bit of credibility in my eyes when it comes to actually making a conclusion about whether or not the president did anything untoward. Amash has been, in the past, one of the few honest congressmen, in my opinion. I feel that whether you agree or disagree with him, he does tend to state his own opinion. I've never seen him be particularly bombastic or assert overtly partisan rhetoric in one way or the other. After Trump came around, you had a lot of partisan Republicans who didn't like him, who ended up becoming partisan Democrats who still had an R next to their name, like John Kasich. Kasich is a good example of a very partisan Republican before Trump came around. And since Trump came around, he's still a Republican, but he pretty much regurgitates partisan Democratic talking points. So in that sense, you can't really lump in somebody like Justin Amash with the Never Trump crowd of, like the neocons at the Weekly Standard, for example, folks like Bill Kristol. However, in this case, I think that his view is very much in line with the establishment left, and particularly his reasoning. I think as a fellow libertarian, I have some room to judge Amash, because I do, at least to some extent, care about the Constitution itself, and if I were a government official, I would at least take that oath seriously. While I think the Constitution is imperfect and would ideally be replaced, once you have accepted the premise of its existence, I think that it would be best to try and abide by it as closely as possible. And according to Amash, this is his justification for stating that the president committed an impeachable offense. Because, of course, impeachable offenses are vaguely defined by the Constitution. But Amash apparently thinks that impeachment essentially is a punishment for disregarding the public trust, or betraying the public trust was how he put it. And according to him, he felt that William Barr's public statements about the Mueller report were false or incorrect at the very least, and he felt that that was based on the instruction of the president, and that I kind of misunderstand his argument here a bit. I don't think he was trying to say that Barr misrepresenting the contents of the Mueller report was itself an impeachable offense. However, it seems to me that this was a part of his case. The core of his case, though, appeared to be that Trump committed, some acts of obstruction that did not meet the standard for criminal prosecution, but did meet the standard for impeachment, which I do agree that the impeachment standard is weaker than criminal prosecution. And frankly, I think that just about every modern president, considering what little regard the presidents of our recent decades have had for the Constitution, it would be pretty easy to impeach just about any of them on some grounds. The question then becomes, is impeaching the president something that really you ought to do? Is it worth going through all that rigmarole? Because we've already set the precedent in the past that most presidents can get away with just about anything that's unconstitutional, so long as it is not too offensive to the public. The reason why Nixon and Bill Clinton were threatened to be removed from office, even though neither of them actually ended up being removed from office, were not because they necessarily committed impeachable offenses, but rather because their impeachable offenses actually offended the conscience of many Americans. So in this case, then, I would ask Mr. Amash, really, who is all that bothered in the public by what the president did? Because I personally, as a libertarian, don't have any problem with what the president did, because what I look at, with the president's crimes, or rather indications that he may have committed crimes of the obstruction of justice, really are no concern to me, because I look at that kind of like intra-Washington squabbling. I refuse to accept the premise that somehow the folks at the FBI, particularly at the highest levels, are well-intentioned, impartial people. They are a centralized secret police force on the level of the Russian FSB. And while most FBI agents are engaged in working with local police departments on normal crimes and murders and things like that actually do deserve criminal prosecution and investigation. The investigation conducted into the president was a counterintelligence investigation. The whole premise was that apparently these folks thought that President Trump was a Russian puppet. And why did they think that, you might ask? Well, it's not as complicated as a lot of people have tried to make it out to be. It's not because of, secret meetings or anything like that. It's quite simply because Trump was not a super ultra hawk during the campaign. These people were scared to death that Trump would get into office and he might not fight every war in the Middle East that they encouraged him to fight. They thought he just might not care if the Russians started some kind of war in Eastern Europe in some place that, most Americans have never even heard of. In short, the FBI was afraid that Trump would actually make good on his campaign promises and put America first and stop trying to be the world empire policing everyone in every corner of the planet. Now, of course, to a great extent, Trump really hasn't done that at all, so the FBI's fears were unwarranted. I mean, look, John Bolton is the national security advisor and Mike Pompeo is the Secretary of State. And of course a former executive of Boeing is now the Secretary of Defense. There's really no hope for the anti-war cause right now. But with all that said, Amash seems to accept the premise then that this was somehow a legitimate investigation instead of a purely political witch hunt, which I, as someone who is not a fan of the president for the reasons I just stated, because he has gone back on all of his promises to, withdraw American troops from the world and stop interfering in foreign wars, even I can see that this was just a witch hunt by the FBI. You can tell that Andy McCabe honestly thinks that because Trump said that he was willing to work with Putin in Syria during the campaign, that means that Trump is working for the GRU. So therefore, I applaud the president for not taking this seriously and for not falling into their traps. I applaud him for getting away in much the same way that a lot of black people in the 90s applauded O.J. Simpson for getting off, even though they knew he was guilty. And if the FBI's disingenuousness and, frankly, pro-war position wasn't enough to deter libertarian Justin Amash from impeaching the president, perhaps the unconstitutionality of the FBI itself would get his attention. Considering that Amash is, to my knowledge, maybe other than Thomas Massie, is the most strict constitutionalist in the U.S. House of Representatives, I would like to ask him where exactly in the Constitution the FBI is justified. Because in my reading of the Constitution, I don't see a federal police force or a secret police anywhere in there. And in fact, like a lot of unconstitutional agencies, the FBI didn't exist until after World War II, neither did the CIA. And frankly, I think it's much easier to try and justify the CIA constitutionally as a part of, national defense than it is to justify having a federal police force when we have local police forces all around the country. I mean, that was known at the time of the Constitution's ratification. There seemed to be in the minds of the framers no sense that the federal government would be enforcing criminal law. I mean, I don't think that you can even have federal crimes in the sense that we do, as far as, a federal murder crime and things other than perhaps off of federal lands. But when you're not talking about federal lands or like the District of Columbia and U.S. territories, there's no real reason to have a federal police force, constitutionally speaking, that is. And Mr. Amash, from what I understand, cares about the Constitution more than anything, and that's why he's speaking out against the president, because he supposedly cares about the Constitution and thinks that he's violated, that he's met the threshold for impeachment. But again, if he's such a strict constitutionalist, why doesn't he advocate for the end of the FBI itself? And how can a president obstruct the investigation of an unconstitutional agency and then be impeached for violating the Constitution? That's kind of like, I guess quite literally, the Trump supporters would say, that would be like impeaching a president for thwarting a coup d'etat. I mean, people have to understand that not only is the FBI an unconstitutional agency, but they work directly for the president, which is part of a reason why they're dangerous. But in this case, they pretty much revolted against the executive, and the executive did not comply with, their efforts to thwart him. And again, I have no dog in this race, because I don't think that Trump turned out to be a particularly great president anyway. The fact remains that the the FBI was not well-intentioned, and that if this had been, say, Jeb Bush that got elected, there would have been no FBI investigation, no matter what suspicions of compliance with Russia there was, because they knew that, oh, we don't have to worry about Jeb Bush being a Russian spy because we know that he wants to bomb Moscow. Now, one final point I'd like to get to, if Mr. Amash really wants to impeach the president, there is something that I think is perfectly justifiable and something that would offend the American people if presented to them that you could impeach Trump on, and that would be the war in Yemen. The war in Yemen was specifically rebuked by Congress. Congress does not approve of this war, and the president has been waging it since the day he was inaugurated because the war was started by Barack Obama. The war in Yemen is the greatest humanitarian disaster on the planet today, which is quite offensive, and we're helping the monarchy, the absolute monarchy in Saudi Arabia, starve the people of Yemen through a blockade and a bombing campaign, which includes blowing up their food supply. And we're not just starving out the military or the militias or whoever's fighting. We're starving innocent women and children. There is a massive cholera outbreak, for example, because they don't have any water services anymore. Starvation is one of the slowest and worst ways to die. I think if anyone wants to impeach Trump, it would be very easy to just try and tie him to the genocide in Yemen, which he's very clearly complicit in. And frankly, you could probably get him on war crimes, too. But, unfortunately, that will never happen because that would expose the dirty secret that, or not so secret, idea that Barack Obama started the war in Yemen and is equally complicit in this unconstitutional genocide and should have also been impeached, if not thrown in prison for war crimes. So that's about all I think I need to say on that topic. If you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do subscribe, please do click the bell because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you back here tomorrow.